Today we are diving into to understand the economic impacts and implications from the coronavirus on our development sector, the construction sector of our economy in Seattle, in downtown, and in our region. Coming out of 2019, we had about 4.5 million square feet of office space that was completed, and another 4.5 million scheduled to be completed in 2020 and into 2021. The development and construction sector has been significant to our economic growth in downtown and to our city's tax collection, particularly over the last 10 years, with a record amount of investment in our community. And we've assembled a panel to help us understand the near-term and potentially the long-term impacts from the economic devastation that we've seen across a number of sectors in our community as a result of the coronavirus. With us today is Morgan Shook, who is a director and partner at Echo Northwest, focused on real estate, land use, and economic analysis. We've had the great pleasure of working with Morgan and his firm for a number of years, and he's supported a number of DSA's policy initiatives and informed our policy agenda. Welcome, Morgan. With us also is Jared Kadri, senior market analyst with CoStar Group. Jared's at the forefront of analyzing economic and real estate trends across sectors and property types. And Greg Johnson. Greg is the CEO of Wright Runstad and Company, which manages and develops properties throughout the Pacific Northwest. Currently has the Rainier Square project under construction in downtown Seattle and is leading the development of the Spring District outside of downtown Bellevue. I also want to acknowledge Greg's service on the board of the Downtown Seattle Association since 2008 and has also been an active member of the board of the Bellevue Downtown Association as well. We're grateful for each of you joining us today and bringing your insights and expertise to this question around the implications to development and construction from the severe economic impacts that we've seen ripple across our region. Morgan, we want to start with you, and I know you've got some slides that you're going to share. I just want to sort of set up your remarks and provide a bit of context. We've asked you to give us a sense of the significance of the construction and development sector in our city, to our tax collections and revenues, and to help us understand the implications and recovery from 2008 and what we foresee from the immediate impacts today. So I'll turn it over to you and may have some follow-up questions. And then we will go to Jared, who will speak to his thinking around the longer term implications to the market across property types, rent implications, and vacancy as well. And then ask Greg for his perspective from where he sits as a major developer and owner in the Seattle and Bellevue market. So I'll turn it over to you, Morgan, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, John, for the remarks there and getting us started. Emily, can you move us on to the first slide here? Thank you. So just a little context, right? And I think probably most folks who are dialed in today are not surprised to see this, given the amount of activity we've seen in the city over the last 10 years. But if we just look at 2018 construction, so we're not even talking about sort of A&E contributions or people working on the legal financial side, but just the stuff that gets built, roughly equated to about $8 billion of investment in 2018. So if we turn those into sort of the good that investment creates, right, it turns into sort of direct construction jobs, folks in both the labor and skilled industries, so roughly 28,000 jobs. All that sort of spending and supply chain effects sort of ripples through the state economy, so about doubles that to about 45,000 jobs. And a lot of that work, right, outside of materials goes right to labor. And so much of that, more than half that investment actually sort of ends up in the pocketbooks of employees. And so, but you know, the goodness doesn't stop there because of the way the Washington State tax code works. construction activity, both labor and materials, is taxable at the state rate, but also then those firms that collect that money pay the B&O, but then they also that investment then allows jurisdictions to grow their property tax revenues. So just that construction activity in the city of Seattle translated into $100 million in city tax revenues. So big effects. So, okay, next slide. So what's happened since COVID? Obviously, the stop work orders related to the public health measures meant to sort of stem the spread of the virus have had sort of tremendous effects on companies that are engaged in those activities in this sector. And so if we look at sort of just 2012 and compare it to 2019, over a similar sort of 10-week period, there have been 90,000 more uninsurance claims in the construction sector. Obviously, we all heard the big news yesterday about potential issues of fraud, so maybe put an asterisk next to some of these numbers. But anecdotally, I think the features of this are probably not surprising to many folks in the real estate and construction industries. So let's put that $90,000 uninsurance and unemployment claims in context. And Emily, can you go to the next slide? So during the Great Recession, we saw sort of the construction sector obviously get battered pretty heavily, given the sort of focus, the sort of focal points in the sort of construction industry and home building, and the recovery taking tremendously longer than the overall recovery. And so this has obviously had sort of big impacts on issues of housing affordability and other things, just as the industry has just taken harder and harder to longer and longer to recover relative to the overall economy. But also that 90,000 jobs in context, right? At the peak job loss from 2027, there were 77,000 less jobs in the industry. So that 90,000, and it took roughly 2.5 years to get to that sort of dip. And so just to give you some sort of sense of sort of that 90,000, it's a pretty big drop relative to what we experienced during the Great Recession. And so then, so the question here is really about sort of what role can development play kind of moving forward? You want to go to the next slide. So the question here is really about what the feature of the recovery is going to look like. And the sort of the trendy thing right now that people are talking about is sort of the square root recovery, and not sense of a math question, but in the sense of sort of the way that curve will look like, right? So it's an inverted square root sign. And so the pieces here, I think, in terms of policy and recovery we should be paying attention to is what trajectory does the recovery take? Obviously, we've all experienced that sharp, severe drop in the investment and employment, and we're starting to see some bounce back, obviously, as those public health measures are rolled back. And so we're seeing kind of a lot of that initial bounce back. People had contracts, they have projects to get done, and we're going to see that. And we're going to be moving into a phase here of reopening that is definitely uncertain. But the question is how quickly will it look like? The optimist would say, well, maybe it's going to be a little more like a V. There's a lot of pent up demand. This is a temporary kind of thing. There aren't big structural damage to the economy. And so hopefully we can kind of move fairly quickly. Others think this could be something a little more like a U, or potentially a W, a double dip recession. It takes a lot longer to sort of move forward. And I think nobody has that crystal ball, but those are kind of your bookends on the recovery. So to me, the question then is really about what role can public policy play with land construction that can help speed things along. So if we look at just the permits during a normal period of time, say January till today, over the last 3 years, the city's averaged roughly about 400 permits taken in during that time. This year, there's been about a 30% drop. So we're down to a little bit below 300 permits. And obviously the composition of those permits is a little different. They aren't as valuable, they aren't as sort of for bigger projects, but we do see sort of that decline. But the other big issue is there are hundreds of permits that are currently in some form of design review or the MUP process. And the question for public policymakers, I think, is really about what feature can they do with respect to sort of helping get the industry sort of facilitated to kind of move projects forward, is sort of in that sort of process. So I think the big questions here are what reforms, or either short-term or long-term, to the review process that allows projects to kind of move through that permitting process more expediently. Because I think most folks, anecdotally, and maybe even some of the data kind of bear this out, that projects are just taking a lot longer to make it through that cycle. So for example, here's next chart, Emily. This chart here just shows is basically kind of follows sort of the construction activity in the city of Seattle over the last 15 years or so. And what it shows here is really the sort of tax consequences of that. And so obviously we talked about sort of the economic impacts of what it looks like in 2018, but there's also sort of this ramp up. And so the city can help sort of facilitate two things: obviously getting that investment, getting dollars into the wallets of workers in that space, but also sort of helping sort of the sort of tax picture and keeping the city sort of more liquid and solvent and continue to deliver sort of critical services. So I think there's a lot of reason to be thinking about sort of policy and the sort of permitting process that sort of moves those projects forward. So if we look just at things that are currently in some form of design review or the MUP process, projects approximately sort of equate to around $15 billion worth of construction investment. That obviously translates into about 50,000 direct jobs in the construction sector and roughly $200 million in city tax revenues. So I think the thing that we should be paying attention to are those types of moves to sort of facilitate, expedite, and just, I think, try to find the sort of the beneficial parts of the design review and the permitting process, but then weigh that against sort of the cost of time and figure out sort of what the sort of right balance point is here that sort of helps kind of speed the economic recovery. So at least public policy can help move that sort of economic recovery curve to look more like a V and less like a U. So I think that should be the outcome.
Thank you, Morgan. And just to clarify, a follow-up question on your last slide here. This is just City of Seattle tax collections, is that correct?
This is just City of Seattle tax collections.
And it's the one-time collections from the construction activity, not counting the ongoing collections from the development itself.
That's correct, John. Yeah. So this is kind of the tip of the iceberg of the contributions that new investment flows to the city. The big impact, obviously, once buildings are built, you've got, with sales tax sourcing, you've got additional sales tax dollars flowing those folks from a lot of it from e-commerce. You have obviously them occupied by for employees and businesses paying the B&O tax. But the real big hidden one is it helps grow the city's sort of tax revenues, property tax revenues long-term, given the quirks we have in our property tax system stemming from Initiative 747. So all to say is council members can either balance the budget on the cost side, or they can sort of help sort of land development and economic development move forward and try to balance the budget on the revenue side. And I think everybody probably prefers the latter rather than the former.
Well, you've given us a good picture of the real significance of construction and development activity to our economy and city tax revenues in Seattle. And we've asked Jared to help us understand the implications of the economic impacts that we've seen across sectors in our community and in our region to the demand side, and to look forward and over the horizon to the best he can to help us understand across property types and markets what the implications may be. Jared, you spend your days developing forecasts and trends and trying to take the data we have today and translating it into potential implications and trends long term. I'll turn it over to you to walk us through some slides, I think first on sort of the unemployment picture across sectors, and then your sense of the implications across property types around investment and rents as well.
Great. Thanks a lot, John. Yeah, as John mentioned, I work at CoStar Group. We are the #1 provider of commercial real estate information and data. The presentation today will cover, recent economic trends, and there's really a lot to talk about. in the face of COVID-19, but also going to focus on the office and apartment sectors, just because those have been the hot topic issues in the downtown area really since the last recession. So if we move to the next slide, we'll go over an agenda for the day. And by the day, I mean 10 minutes, so it's pretty short. Economy is, we're going to talk about recent and initial unemployment claims by sector. Morgan did a great job by looking at construction, and we'll cover the other ones there and look at it throughout the Tri-County area and how that relates to downtown. Then we'll jump into office. The office market, of course, the big question is what's the health of the office market, status of the market? And a lot of people are asking, okay, is this going to lead to lower demand for space? Is it going to lead to more demand because companies are going to want more space to have space in between employees for social distancing? I think that question is kind of, and the answer is still up in the air, but it seems like certain companies will have very lenient work from home policies. We've already heard about the major tech companies extending their work from home policies, including Twitter, which doesn't really have a Seattle presence. They've said that workers can work from home indefinitely. Then we'll conclude with apartments. Apartments have kind of been the hottest asset type this cycle, or I shouldn't say this cycle, it's last cycle. I think we're truly in a recession. But over the past 10 years or so, apartments have been really the hottest asset type, especially in the Seattle area. So we'll talk about the status of the apartment market. Next slide, please. All right, so jumping into the economy. We have a chart here looking at all the major metros. There's kind of the largest metros there. There are 40 total metros. You can get an idea of where we're projecting job losses to be for the second quarter, which we're in the midst of. What is that based off? The orange is going to be the percentage of the first quarter of 2020's labor force losing jobs in 2020 Q2. And then the number is going to be the total number of jobs. This is based off our forecast, the base case scenario, which ultimately comes from Oxford Economics baseline scenario. So the ultimate effect in Seattle is supposed to be about 318,000 job losses. This is total employment. We're not focusing on specific sectors on this slide. It's about 15% of the labor force. Now that sounds really bad, and I agree, that's a pretty alarming number. But you compare that with some other metros that are not as diversified as Seattle, which are on the top of the chart there. Las Vegas, about 21% of the total labor force expected to lose their jobs. Orlando, same thing. What's the commonality here? Commonality is, of course, a tourist-oriented economy. Now, Seattle has grown as a tourist economy, but it's definitely not the bulk of the market. A place like Las Vegas or Orlando is already bearing the brunt of major job losses in the services and hospitality sectors. And I think, it just shows that Seattle is pretty well positioned relative to other markets because of its tech-oriented nature. Next slide, please. All right, so this looks pretty similar to Morgan's slide on construction. We're just looking at all sectors. They're a little bit small, but I'll explain them to you there. The top 5 sectors for total job losses, in other words, initial unemployment claims, assuming the data is correct based on what John said with some of the fraud going on. But per the data from Washington State, the top 5 sectors are kind of expected. At least 3 of the 5 were expected for me. Accommodation and food services, number 1 by a long shot. Nearly 70,000 jobs throughout the Tri-County area. A lot of those jobs are in King County just because of sample size, a much larger population. We also have manufacturing. Manufacturing, very interesting. This is also kind of expected, and I think this will have a major impact on the industrial market throughout the Seattle area. The good thing, recent news in Seattle is that Amazon is on a leasing tear in the South Sound area, so that should help. I think e-commerce will help kind of soften the effect, but manufacturing-oriented properties are likely to take a major hit, and we are projecting vacancy to go up a lot. The other ones, retail, trade, very similar to accommodation and food services, kind of the lion's share of job losses in pretty much every metro, so that makes sense. But the 2 that surprised me a little bit, especially healthcare and social assistance. We hear about our frontline warriors, fighting COVID-19, the nurses, the doctors. They're really, they're working extra hard and saving our lives. But this number is, it's only a small part of this sector. There's other, elective procedures like dentists, plastic surgeons, whatever it may be. Dentists are now allowed to resume operations starting this week in Washington, so that'll be good news. But a lot of those folks have lost their jobs, and it also includes the social assistance aspect of the economy, which importantly includes daycare, which I'm sure a lot of those folks out there who have kids can kind of empathize with daycare employees during these days. The construction numbers, Morgan went over these in detail, but the good news is that things are improving just because of the end of the construction ban. A lot of people are getting back to work, and this has a huge implication for the downtown area in general, especially for apartments and office, where for the office market, you have more than half of all square footage in the downtown core. And then for apartments, you have a little bit over 40% of total inventory in the metro. So we'll go to the next slide, please. All right, so jumping into the office market, one of the main metrics I think for looking at a downturn is sublease listings. We've seen this in a lot of tech markets, and during the Great Recession, San Francisco was notorious for having a lot of subleases. I think Seattle, you did see some of that as well. You can kind of go back in the chart there, going back to 06, 07. But we are seeing a notable increase in sublease listings throughout the metro. A lot of these are in downtown Seattle. And it's a little bit hard to see just because it's small, but we're going to zoom in. But just to show you the trend over time, that big blip in early 2019 is due to some major projects, tenants offering space up for sublease in a lot of parts of the metro, but especially downtown. One of our esteemed panelists, Greg, will talk about Rainier Square, but Rainier Square is a big part of that in early 2019. And again, this is not necessarily space that has been subleased, it's space that was put up for sublease. So we'll talk about it on a little bit more detail for downtown on the next slide. All right, so this is showing the share of those subleases. We kind of zoom in to 2017 through today. Technically the beginning of the week. But we're looking at the share of downtown subleases as a percentage, the share of the total market. But blue is going to be downtown as the Downtown Seattle Association defines it. So a lot of this space that's been put up for sublease going back to 2017 has been in the downtown area. When we look more specifically in the past couple of months, April reached a high for the year, and a lot of spaces coming online. I think, many of them can be attributed to the coronavirus, including the two here. 83 King, 50,000 square feet in Pioneer Square, those put up for sublease. And then Met Park East, 80,000 square feet in Denny Triangle put up by Swedish Health. The May data is, still remains to be seen for the entire month, but it'll be very interesting to see how the end of May turns out. And next slide, please. And we get into apartments. This is one of the coolest things about apartments. It's one of my favorite properties to track just because, everyone needs a place to live and the data is so dynamic, right? So the dynamic data is thanks to apartments.com and our affiliates. We get feeds on a daily basis and we're able to see real-time data, kind of a high frequency indicator compared to certain economic data points. And what you see here in green is the 2020 data. We've seen kind of a major downshift in rent growth for apartments in the Seattle area. This is going to be the whole Tri-County area. That's about a 1.5% decrease since mid-March. March 10th was the peak for rents in the overall Seattle area. And we've seen a decrease of about 1.5% in 2 months. That's about 9% annualized. Now, I don't anticipate this pace to continue throughout the rest of the year. You never know, but at the rate it's on pace to be 9%, but hopefully we'll see some improvement. We've already seen improvement in May, as you can see with the flattening there with the data. But the important thing to consider is the past years. This is typically the busy season for apartment leasing. 2018, 2019, we saw major upticks. That was also the case for most of the years in the past decade. And we'll talk about downtown Seattle specifically on the next slide. Of course, one of the hot areas for apartment development in recent years. So downtown Seattle, a little bit of a different picture, right? Same trend, increases in the spring season in past years, and then a major decrease this year due to the unprecedented COVID-19 crisis. The rents are a lot higher. We were averaging about $3.50 per square foot. And the rent decreases are also a lot sharper, about 2.5% in 2 months. The exact number from March 10th until, I guess, a few days ago, it was 2.7%. So the 2.5 was in about 2 months. Again, these rents have kind of flattened, the softening, just like the overall downtown or overall Seattle area. So hopefully we'll see some improvement, but as it is now, we have seen rents go down by more than 2.5% since mid-March. And that concludes my presentation. The next slide has my contact information. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I'm available on the phone or via email.
Thank you, Jared. Greg, I want to turn to you, and you have a unique perch as both a developer and an owner of office and retail and residential, so across sectors and on both sides of the lake. And I might ask you first just to maybe summarize the status of your two big projects for the Spring District and Rainier Square, just so we're all oriented to the work that you're leading.
Sure. Thanks, John, and Jared and Morgan. That's great stuff. I'll start with Rainier Square downtown, and as I was looking at all that data, I'm reflecting on how Rainier Square, just on that single block, has just about every dynamic that was talked about, so far. The project has several components. We started it in 2014, originally conceived to have office, retail, residential, and hotel. We made a decision in early 2019 to pivot and change our hotel building to an office building. And so, and just this week, we finished our financing on that component of the project. So the office project called 400 University will be under construction here shortly. But just overall, 700,000 plus square feet of office space that was 100% leased to Amazon, still 100% leased to Amazon, but shows up in the sublease statistics. They've been successful in subleasing a portion of that and have a lot of interest on the rest. So, we're certainly encouraged there. 191 apartments at the top of the building, 39th floor to the 58th floor. We were just about to launch our marketing on that until when the COVID thing hit. It set back our construction a little bit, but then also we'll start pre-marketing that later this year. And then the retail space, we've got about 80,000 square feet of retail space in the project. Certainly some restaurant areas that give us some pause these days, and then a PCC market, which is from a business standpoint really a thriving essential business and something that's going to be terrific in the downtown. But then we also had an Equinox Fitness Club, and that opening has certainly been pushed back until such time as they can really figure out what their business is, and then kind of some street retail. So the silver lining that we've tried to identify as well, we hadn't completed everything yet, and so because so many things are going to need to be rethought, it gives us the opportunity to try to incorporate some of that into the project as we finish it. Just we'll be getting our occupancy permit late this year. The apartments will open up early next year. So you really start seeing life on the block next year, early next year. So that's Rainier Square. Over on the other side of the lake in the Spring District, that probably also has similar things going on, but it's going to end up being about a 4 million square foot total development project. It's got to date 800 apartments, and REI was just on the cusp of opening their headquarters when the COVID thing hit, and I can talk in more detail about that. That's an interesting story. But then we've also leased and pre-leased a total of 3 buildings to Facebook. So we're working with them and living with them as they are thinking about how they're going to adjust their workspaces. And then we've got a lot more space out there to be developed. We remain super encouraged about it. You know, I think the market's really spoken on you know, how access to transit and kind of the locational attributes have helped that project really gain some momentum. But we're in, you know, kind of intensely interested in working as closely as we can, both with users that have leased buildings that we're building and are not yet leased yet, but then also working with tenants that in buildings that we property manage. And so maybe I'll stop there and you can ask me, you know, point me in the direction that you want to take it.
Well, I'd be interested in your perspective on just the more immediate implications for office demand in the broader market,
Yeah.
and the impacts relative to other recessions that you've witnessed and been through, and you've been in this industry a long time in this region. What do you see as sort of immediate impacts on the demand side on office?
Well, I think for the large tech users, they have a ton of momentum in their plans, and so, you know, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, Google, each is going to make adjustments. But when you look at the growth that those businesses are experiencing, and the fact that they serve a global market, I see a sustained momentum, sustained demand from them. You know, they're still hiring people. You know, the unknown question there is, how does the work from home play out in those contexts? But even with that, data security is super important to those types of companies, and many times you just can't get that at home. So a significant part of their workforce, they're very interested in getting back to the office as quickly as they can. With other smaller tenants, I think you know, this has been a big awakening, where we're all doing this Zooming and working from home, and definitely road testing, you know, the ability to function and what kind of efficiency, whatever business you're in, whether it's law, banking, finance, whatever, you know, it's being tested. And I think out of that, you're seeing some companies have said, whoa, okay, yeah, we should have done this sooner, you know, and you know, maybe some of that sublease space is reflective of that. You know, so you've got that effect. We're not going to know when people start coming back into the office how the distancing protocols are really going to affect the you know, the end to that story. But I think if you were a medium to small size business and you had a real estate decision to make in the, you know, anywhere from February to later this year, you put that on hold to the extent you can, and you know, trying to figure things out.
And then what do you make for the longer term implications, assuming we get to a point of a vaccine and that's widely available, and treatments and address sort of the health and safety, security concerns? What do you make of the demand for urban space across the sectors that you're involved in places like Seattle, but other urban areas in our country that have been so successful over the last decade in particular?
Well, if it unfolds as you painted it, John, where there is a vaccine and there is you know, kind of I'll call it a return to normalcy, I think that the cities like Seattle that have the attributes that attract, that make it a great place to live and work and raise your kids and things like that, those are the places that are going to continue to not just survive but flourish. You know, we've had a big economic shock. There is no denying that, and there are businesses that aren't going to exist after this, and this unemployment, you know, while everybody's getting some form of a government check, it seems like these days, maybe that lasts till November. I don't know, you know, but I don't think that we're a country that is comfortable putting everybody on government support for very long. So that's going to have to get unwound, and it's kind of like the tide going out, and then what boats are sitting on the bottom, what are still floating. I mean, there's just been a big shock. So I think it was Jared who said this cycle. I think we're on the downside now of this cycle, and we're going to go into a trough, and remains to be seen how that plays out.
And what are you hearing from your existing tenants about their desire to return to the office, to reopen, and what are they looking for from property managers and owners as far as the safety and health measures that are necessary to support that? What are those conversations like today?
Well, they're very concerned. So every tenant that we work with in one of our buildings or others that we've interfaced with, the safety of their employees is paramount, and they're hearing from their employees that they want a very safe environment before they come back into work, or before they're required to come back to work. So that's all the distancing measures. And I should separate this. Some companies are actually talking about doing testing of their employees. I think as a building manager, we're not going to get into the testing realm and temperature taking as a building manager, but I wouldn't be surprised to see, large users in particular start to put some of those protocols in place to actually enter their space. From a building manager standpoint, certainly people, are going to demand a clean building that has clear directional signage and the procedures for using the elevator and where the waiting areas are and how you check in. Those need to be very distinct and be evidence that you're following protocols. Cleaning used to be you do cleaning at night. I think people are going to want to see things getting cleaned, and so you'll see more of that going on during the day. They'll want to know that the cleaning's been stepped up and happening at multiple times during the day. But I know the people that run the businesses that are tenants in our building are very focused on making sure their employees are not just safe but comfortable and perceive themselves as being safe when they come into the office. Transit's an interesting thing there, because that's just getting to the office is from a distancing and transmission thing is a challenge in and of itself. So I think that's going to be a governor as well on folks coming back into the office.
Well, thanks for sharing all that perspective, Greg. We want to open it up now to your live questions, and we encourage you to raise your virtual hand. We can't see your real one, so if you can raise your virtual hand, and Emily will call on you, and we will unmute you and ask you to unmute yourself, and invite you to put a question to one of our panelists.
We don't have any live questions yet, John, but there's a few that have been submitted in the Q&A.
We'll take a few out of the Q&A box here while we allow you to raise your hand and ask a virtual question if you have one. But Greg, I might put this one to you from Bill Lewis around maybe the immediate and long-term impacts for the desire of folks to live downtown. You've got, I think you mentioned 191 apartments on top of Rainier Square. What's your sense of the impact on residential demand in the short and the long term?
Well, short term, I think we've seen what's happened in the slides. I think it's interesting, and I have this effect in my home as well. You've got a number of people that worked in one city that had an apartment in that city that might have retreated to another city, like where their family home was or something else, just because they weren't required to come to the office and they could work from anywhere, and they decided to work somewhere else, and so they've given up their apartment. That's certainly going to that's evidence right there of some impact. I think more longer apartment buildings are going to have to again, there's two paths. You come up with a vaccine, everything's back to normal. I think the attributes of downtown living are pretty compelling to a big chunk of the population, and you'll see little effect if there's big long-term shifts in how we use our space. Then I think at the margin there would be people that would have chosen to live downtown that'll be more comfortable in an area with more space, whether it's they don't have to get into an elevator, just more room, a little more outdoor space, and that's going to have an impact on a downward impact on the demand for downtown living. That story is yet to be written.
Jared, there's just a clarifying question, I think, on one of the slides you shared discussing the declines in rents. I think that was specific to apartments in the downtown market. Is that correct? Or
that's correct. The first chart will be Seattle Metro, so the MSA, King, Snohomish, and Pierce counties. The second chart was downtown Seattle in particular.
And then you showed the unemployment claims across sectors. And I don't know if you can speak to this directly, but there was a question around just the overall size of those sectors and total number of jobs relative to those that have been impacted by this economic crisis. And do you have perspective you can offer on just sort of the share of jobs across sector that have been those sectors that have been most impacted?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have the exact numbers offhand. I can get them. But I can tell you that, the manufacturing numbers to me stick out. I think, we're a very tech-oriented metro in the Seattle area, which, worth mentioning too, I didn't say that, was information it's a very small number on that chart, right? We're always thought of kind of as a tech-oriented area. And the information sector hasn't seen that many initial claims. I think that's because companies are well capitalized and very good work from home policies. But I think, overall, the numbers, I'd have to get the exact share. But manufacturing, to me, I think for the Tri-County area makes up a significant share. And that was one of the big ones for the top 5.
Greg, you noted the constraints around the public transit system is, that's how we've moved a lot of people throughout the region, certainly in and out of downtown for work purposes. Are you seeing yet a greater desire for parking from some of your tenants that maybe over the last several years have moved to subsidizing transit passes? Are those conversations happening around mode shifts?
I think there's a lot of anticipation of mode shifts, but we just haven't seen the people coming back to the office at all to yet be able to understand how the shift between transit and single occupant vehicles are going to happen. A big dramatic effect has been in the construction industry, which was where for decades we've been trying to get construction workers to carpool to the job site, because you never have enough parking. And now they've been told they can't carpool. So every construction site that is underway is filling up a lot of parking because you're getting all those folks coming in single occupant vehicles. I think, again, at the margin, you've just got to, until there's some, kind of back to normal kind of state, there are definitely going to be more people in single occupant vehicles. Just to what extent, we just don't know yet.
Yeah, we certainly have a big challenge of how we move people in and out as we reopen with the constraints and restrictions on the transit system. And to your point around, hadn't thought of the construction industry and their demand for parking downtown, and now that it's increased significantly if they're not able to carpool. Yeah.
I mean, I will. It's interesting, the earlier question about downtown living, and I think the transit to, being able to walk places, in many ways, apartments are going to be able to, if they're thoughtful, create safer and perceived safer environments, and then be able to offer the ability to not rely on public transit as much, and then not have to force people into their cars, and you know, if you think about it, if it's a well-managed, well thought out complex or building, the perception will be you might actually be on whole safer.
Do you anticipate tenants wanting more space and needing more space to allow their workers to spread out over the next couple of years? The per office worker square footage number I know has shrunk over the last decade. Do you see that reversing? And do you see also certain other types of spaces being converted for other uses where there's stronger demand?
Yeah, I think, well, the first part of the question on the on office, you know, kind of the density of offices. I mean, so many particularly tech offices have gone to benching, where you're literally, you know, 12 inches, 24 inches away from other people, and there's people directly across from you and whatnot. That's going to have to change at a minimum in the at least in the near term, and whether they do that through just having 50% of the people who work in that office working there on any particular day, or if they permanently say, okay, we're going to have everybody come back, but now everybody needs to sit further apart. And the other things is there was a lot of focus on the serendipitous meeting spaces in offices and the kitchens and those things, and those are going to need to be addressed. How are those going to get rethought? You know, there's certainly areas where there can be a lot of transmission. So, so those are, yeah, again, you know, we're not sure how those are going to play out. Now, the second part of your question, remind me on
just a conversion of spaces that maybe were built for one use where that demand may not be there as strong over the next couple of years.
You know, it pains me to say it, but, you know, our retail sector has been decimated. And so, you know, we've had in our own portfolio, you know, restaurants that have said, no mas, I'm done. You know, I'm not coming back. Here's the space. So I think how those get addressed, certainly some are candidates for reuse, for different uses, but you know, there's some talk about, you know, office space that has a single entry from the street is going to be way more valuable than stuff where you have to go through common spaces and go through elevators. So, but, you know, putting office space on the street, you know, has impact on street life and those types of things. So, but we're going to see a shift, and I think better, you know, better to have spaces with people in them doing something than vacant boarded up spaces like we're seeing today.
And an additional question for you, Greg, in the Q&A box here is around your building HVAC systems, and are your tenants sort of inquiring around the quality of those HVAC systems and asking for any modifications or enhancements there?
Yeah, we're definitely getting questions. You know, I think, you know, I'll say institutional quality buildings that are well maintained you're getting as much of a input of outside air as you can, as fresh air and whatnot. But you know, when was the last time somebody asked us when we changed the filters? I don't know, but you're certainly getting asked now. And then you know, we've had environments within our buildings that have had higher standards for air quality. It doesn't surprise you know, whether it was data or some kind of medical, whatever, you know, they can easily be built in. I think you're going to see a lot more users looking for a higher level of filtering.
I want to just make sure we don't have any live questions that we're missing. We invite you to ask a live question if you have one.
Nobody's indicated. Oh, there's one. Roger Starkweather. Roger, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi there. So specific to Morgan, you made a comment about a backlog in permitting and expediting. Who can drive that charge? Who can really kind of get the city off a dime? Is that architects? Is that GCs? Yeah, I'm just curious.
I think you've answered a little bit of your question. I would say there's a pretty broad tent of folks here that outside of the obvious folks who are most in the construction sector. Like I think as it framed here, there are really big benefits that flow to the community, to workers, to the city by having a really expedited, sort of process. And so the question here is like, what part of design review and the permitting process are really valuable that we need to take our time on and engage the community, and what parts can kind of move through fairly quickly. And I would say the people who have an interest in that are a pretty broad tent, right? And to include affordable housing advocates, nonprofit developers, and even folks in sort of public, sort of the public services, right? There, the city sort of spends a lot of time and effort with those additional tax dollars to do a lot of work in this sort of housing and community development space. And so marginally, as budgets shrink, that type of spending can typically fall off a little bit. So all to say, I think an organization like the Downtown Seattle Association is a great sort of convener of a broad tent of folks who have a really diverse set of views. And I would say even people within public agencies. I know folks who are planners at various cities who think there's a lot of room for sort of places to make improvements. And so I don't think this is simply a sort of a public sector, private sector issue, but I think there's, room for a good conversation around trying to think about sort of what needs to be revised, what needs to be kept, and sort of how everybody can kind of move forward in a productive way.
I appreciate that. I think in this time of unknown and having the opportunity to rethink how we are efficient in doing business is key to everyone. So I thank you for that.
I wanted to just put a question and maybe ask each of you if you have some perspective on this, but it seems like there's a big difference between obviously the 2008 recession, what we face today as it relates to how the real estate sector and the financial markets were impacted. And we went into this recession with really strong economic fundamentals. The markets were healthy, the financial system was healthy. And Seattle has attracted a lot of national and international capital over the last decade. Presumably, there's still a lot of capital out there that wants to land somewhere, that is looking long-term, that is betting on a vaccine and treatment, and there will be some markets that are able to access that capital and others that don't. Do you foresee that to be the case, and do you agree with that sort of distinction between the differences between the two recessions? And how do you think of Seattle and our ability to continue to attract national capital that believes in sort of our fundamentals, particularly on the office side, but maybe some of the other sectors as well?
Well, I can jump in on that. When comparing this to the 2008 recession, which was a financial sector meltdown that then rippled through and impacted kind of everybody in some way, shape, or form. That first took the legs out of, you had a crash, and then it kind of took the legs out of people's ability to spend, and companies' willingness to hire, and all that kind of stuff. This one, but the finance, the money pulled back dramatically at one point. Here, and you pointed out, John, we have the pressure of folks trying to invest in Seattle, and both on the equity and the debt side. I will say we just 2 days ago we closed a construction loan and equity on the small part of Rainier Square that we switched from hotel to office. And that was a national focused investor that's still thinking about Seattle, and that's a money center bank that is still willing to give a construction loan on a project that isn't leased yet. So I think that's now there aren't many of those going on, but if they're going on, Seattle is one of the places where that has just happened, and I think still can happen.
I have a couple thoughts. So one is, I think, call it kind of not quite recency bias, but we all kind of lived through 2008 and whether we kind of admit it or not, I mean, our current situation really kind of unearth some old maybe wounds that hadn't quite healed yet, right? So I think I'm curious to see how much of our learning from that is going to be applied going forward. I think at the national level, I would say, right, we've seen the Fed and Congress act with a lot more expediency, thank goodness, this time around, particularly on the fiscal side. And obviously there were conversations around doing more as warranted. So I think that's going to be a big difference. But I would say one thing when we look back at the past recession and the recovery is we see a lot of polarization relative to other sort of, particularly real estate markets, in the sense of seeing that the growth, while been pretty good, hasn't been as sort of evenly distributed as it has in the past. So I think the question here, particularly in sort of the effects really, the deeper effects on accommodations, leisure, retail, and is really how that comes back across marketplaces. And maybe that's a function of the big issues around what we learned from states kind of reopening. We got like 50 different natural experiments going on, and as well as sort of the prospect of a vaccine, and to the extent that sort of national mood feels more confident and going forward, particularly as we kind of get out of the summer and into the fall. So I would say those are the kinds of things that we're kind of paying attention to, is sort of just thinking about, obviously our hope is that a recovery happens, but sort of what level and type of unevenness do we need to be paying attention to, obviously across geographies or across asset classes.
Yeah, I'd like to add too. I think, obviously this time's much different because quoting Dr. Fauci, the virus determines when we reopen, right? All depends a lot on the virus and the vaccine. So that creates a lot more uncertainty. Not to say that the financial crash could, that we couldn't see a financial crash as a result. Matter of fact, one of our forecast scenarios is calling for that. But I think to your question, John, about how Seattle could perform in terms of the overall real estate demand, I think Seattle is much better positioned than a lot of markets because it is a very diverse market. You have a lot of tech, you have a lot of professional services, and really all across the board. Other markets, especially the ones I pointed out, Las Vegas, Orlando, many Midwest markets, East Coast markets, they have concentration in a lot of different, maybe more volatile sectors. So in my opinion, I think Seattle is better positioned to weather the storm than many markets around the country.
And thanks for addressing that. There was a note in the chat box to us about that point you made earlier of sort of how Seattle's better positioned. I don't think you're suggesting that we're in good shape today with 15% or so unemployment in the MSA, but I think your point is just relative to other MSAs around the country and their concentration of jobs in a limited number of sectors.
Exactly. And you have the high end, which was 21% for Las Vegas. The difference between 21% and 15% is quite substantial.
Well, I want to be mindful of our time and thank each of our panelists, Jared, Morgan, and Greg, for your participation and the insights that you shared today. A couple of things I want to note before we close. We're fielding currently an economic outlook survey to decision makers, leaders of companies and organizations in Seattle that is on our website. We will share the results in June. We invite you to take it if you have not already, as we all look to get more clarity on the perspectives and the outlook of decision makers across sectors and companies in our community. We'll be fielding that a couple of times over the course of the next several months to gauge attitudes and perceptions around outlook toward reopening and economic recovery in Seattle. We continue to post and gather a significant amount of information and resources on our website, the economic resources that have been made available at the local, state, and federal level. All of that is on our website, and continue to produce virtual events like this and other roundtables for DSA members and also guests. Next week, we will host a roundtable conversation with leaders in our arts community about the significant and really devastating impacts over the last couple of months on our arts sector, on our performance venues in downtown, and what can be done to ensure that they survive and on the other side of this. I want to wish you all a happy Memorial Day and acknowledge all those who've made the ultimate sacrifice to serve and protect our country. I hope you continue to stay safe and healthy and be well. Take care.